Good morning and welcome to Missoula Real Estate Today. This is Denny Bedard. Missoula Real Estate Today is presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Diane's been working with buyers and sellers in the Missoula market for over 25 years and shares her insights on the local housing market. Along with her trusted partners, Diane provides complete service for your real estate transaction and brings us guests who provide useful information on industry-related topics and trends. And now, Missoula Real Estate Today on News Talk, KGVO. As always, we thank you for making Missoula Real Estate Today a part of your weekend here on KGVO. And Diane Beck from Windermere Real Estate always brings us interesting guests. This week, no stranger to the KGVO listening audience. In fact, he's on every weekday morning with his Montana Economic Minute, a regular guest on Talkback. Dr. Patrick Barkey, Director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Welcome to Missoula Real Estate Today.
I'm glad to be here.
What is the mission of the UM Bureau of Business and Economic Research? What decisions might be made based on what your research would share?
Well, it's a pretty simple mission, Denny. It's really we're trying to help Montanans understand the economic environment in which we work and live. So that's a matter of understanding what's ahead of us. Certainly, we're known for our forecasting, but what's less well known is the fact that we do a lot of research. Most of that is what I would call policy research. It's research where we're not inventing anything, but we're understanding how trends and how issues impact the important decision makers and those of us who work and live here.
Because I hear you every weekday morning. How did the Montana Economic Minute originate? You've been doing that for quite some time now.
Well, it's interesting. You know, when I used to be in the Midwest, I wrote a weekly newspaper column. And that was a lot of fun. I thought I was sort of writing into the ether there for a while, but every now and then, eventually people would notice. And here, coming to Montana, we really strive to be a statewide organization. So we're based in Missoula, and we're proud to be part of the Missoula community. But we really try to serve the entire state. And you couldn't help but notice that, AM radio is alive and well across the hinterlands of Montana, and that just struck me as a good way to get our name and to get our brand out there across the whole state.
Is it hard to keep things fresh, or do you have more material than you can get to most of the time?
Well, it's pretty easy as long as no lawyers catch me plagiarizing what I plagiarize. I read a lot and I report on it, and people think I'm smart, but all I do is read and write it down. And so I do steal a lot of ideas from people. But really, there's no shortage of things to talk about when it comes to the economy. I mean, it's interesting. The economy affects all of us, and yet so few people actually understand even the bare essentials of the economy. And that's you find that proved every time gas prices go up, or every time any kind of ordinary economic event happens that changes the world in which we live in. That's economics at work.
That really is one of those trigger mechanisms, isn't it? My goodness, you want to raise my gas 2 cents a gallon to pay for something?
Yes, it's always investigated on the way up, but it's never investigated on the way down.
No. Do you ever wish it was the Montana Economic Minute and a half? It's tough to get everything in there in 60 seconds.
Well, I'll tell you a quick story. I have a Japanese friend of mine who's fascinated with American policy, and he was dying to know the web link to the minute, which of course I gave him, and he got it, and he gave me a very terse reply. He said, "You talk too fast." So yeah, slowing down would probably be good for everybody. But
This is Missoula Real Estate Today. It's presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Our guest, Dr. Patrick Barkey, Director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research. And you conduct, Patrick, an annual Montana economic tour around the state, which I believe a part of it was just recently completed. What do you present? Who attends? And what do you learn?
Well, boy, those are great questions. First, I'd like to correct you. I don't present it. Our team presents it. So I'm the ringleader of the circus, and we present a pretty thorough assessment of the economy of the state of Montana and in the local communities in which we go. So we like to say that we take apart the economy, see what's working, put it all back together, and see how it's running. So it's a unique event because, as you know, news on the economy tends to be dominated by national things.
Sure.
If we hear news about the local economy, it's always bad. It's something closing, that gets our attention. We look at it, we wring our hands. But in fact, the economy is doing pretty well. It's doing pretty well in western Montana, doing pretty well here in Missoula. We'd like to report on that, report on what's driving that growth and what we can expect in the coming year. Boy, we learn a heck of a lot. Lately, we've had these themes for our programs, and our theme this time is finding good workers. It's about the labor market shortages that many employers are facing, the lack of skilled candidates for job openings. We have learned a ton in terms of how different communities are addressing that, what the issues are, and just the individual economic happenings in all the parts of the state that they just don't travel across county lines somehow. You have to actually go to the communities to find out what's going on.
Regardless of the needs and the size of the community, that cannot be a simple solution. Well, we're just going to create more human beings to help us out here. What kind of suggestions or thoughts are you hearing about that?
Well, they fall into two categories. The first is what can individual companies do themselves when they're faced with a situation of not having either enough or any qualified applicants for their openings. And that's kind of a wide spectrum. I mean, one thing is to, for example, lower your qualifications, train more people, look to non-traditional workers. So there's a whole list of things that companies can do. And on the other side of the ledger is what can policymakers do to address this shortage of workers as seen from the eyes of employers. And the answers are both conventional and unconventional. There are an awful lot of able-bodied people who are not in the workforce. So it's a matter of thinking about everything from getting teenagers to work more to looking at the incarcerated population. I mean, looking at drug standards for drug tests for jobs, as well as very conventional things like trying to make it easier for more women to enter the workforce and to enter the workforce on a full-time basis.
And so the recruitment process on their end, that has to be an added challenge as well, I would assume.
Well, and that's its own curveball, right? I mean,
Yeah.
even without labor force shortages, the recruitment process has changed radically. Nowadays, companies have to worry about something called their online reputation, which didn't even exist a decade ago.
Sure.
And yet now it is a big deal. I mean, people can go to websites and see what your workplace is like as your own workers rate you. And if you're a quote bad employer, well, one that doesn't follow through on promises or does whatever kinds of things bad employers do, keeping that a secret is getting to be harder.
Missoula Real Estate Today, presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Our guest, Dr. Patrick Barkey, Director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research. And Patrick, before we get into more specifics about the economics on the Missoula housing market, I'd like to ask you about the building and housing regulations, fees, and so forth around the state. Is that as diversified as it seems?
Well, it's very diversified. If by what you mean, is there a different philosophy? Is there a different level of regulation
Sure.
as you go to different parts of the state? Of course. I mean, we're sitting in one of them, but we are eclipsed by Bozeman. There's certainly a different mindset and a different approach, if you will, to housing issues. One thing. We looked at that issue, by the way, in depth. Our theme of our program last year was affordable housing, and we tried to look at the level of regulation around the state of Montana. We couldn't do that exhaustively. We could only look at a handful of communities that we had data for. It was like half a dozen or so. And most communities in Montana are fairly lightly regulated, particularly when you go by national standards. Now, you have to remember, national standards, that includes both coasts. And compared to California, Montana is like the wild prairie in terms of, stick it up and it goes. But there were a couple of communities, and sadly Missoula was not in that sample, but Bozeman did show up as being more heavily regulated relative to the rest of Montana. So impact fees, I mean, we've done some research projects, worked with the Builders Association a few years back, trying to kind of unpack what's in a house price. And a lot of what's in a house price that you can see in dollar terms are things like impact fees. But more importantly, they're the delays and uncertainty I think that's the critical fact. I think most construction, most builders, they're business people. You give them a problem, tell them what the rules are, they tackle it. The problem with a lot of communities, and Missoula probably falls at least partially into this category, is that the problem keeps changing, it keeps morphing, and the delays and uncertainty really are investment killers.
Can you say those kinds of guidelines, do they drastically affect housing prices, or can they? Is it moderate potential price increases? About where does it fall?
Well, prices are kind of at the end, right? And prices are where the ultimate, implications of all these kinds of, both private and public decisions made regarding new housing. That's where they manifest themselves, right? But if you back up and you simply ask the question, are we building enough housing? And we've tried to look at that question. It's been done on a state-by-state basis. And so what I mean by that is if you look at the fundamentals in the housing market, right, that are driving supply, so things like household formation, right, which is, of course, affected by demographics, it's affected by how many people migrate in, it's affected by economic growth, it's affected by a lot of things. But you look at household formation and you look at the demand that would be induced by that, and you compare that to the supply, and you do see shortages of housing popping up around the state, particularly when you go into individual cities where we don't have the exact data for this. But so that's what we're seeing. And so whatever the reason, builders over this long 10-year expansion that's occurred since the big bust of the Great Recession, builders have not built at the rate that the fundamentals would suggest they should be. And so then that takes you to the last step, which was your question about, does that manifest in prices? Oh, yeah, you better believe it.
Well, would they typically tell you we can't because of the price tag with all of these fees, or we just can't for various reasons imposed by the city that we're talking about?
You can always interview builders. Basically, we're kind of agnostic about that. In other words, the way we try to get the answers to questions is by analyzing the data. I mean, if you analyzed anybody in your workforce and you said, "Gee, do you think you're paid enough?" They'd all say no. I mean, whereas if you did some analysis, you looked at comparable wages, you'd say, well, they're making a market wage, So that's our second approach. So we're not so much. We do hear that, of course. But we discount that as there's a little bit of self-interest in that, and I can appreciate that. Economics is, in a sense, the study of self-interest, if you really boil it all down.
That's well put. Yeah, I like that.
But you're looking at a situation where the building is not taking place. Let me give you just one other example of that. The data indicate that the biggest price appreciation in most markets across the state are on the entry-level homes. All right. The entry-level homes, and what I mean by that are houses in, say, the lowest 25% of the whole spectrum of residential housing, and that's where the price growth is the fastest. That's where it is. And you look at the others, and they're growing as well, but the lower tier ones. Now, just a quick analysis of supply and demand should tell you that is the area of housing where the incentives to build are weakest. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you have to go through all this fixed cost of uncertainty, of development, of zoning, of everything you might need to do, of what exactions as we call them, just the payments you have to make to governments that they impose on you to give you the right to build. You do all those things, and they're like a fixed price tag, right?
Sure.
All right. Now, would you rather spread that fixed price across a higher price property with higher margins or a lower price property with lower margins?
Sure.
And the answer to the market has been clear. The building rate for entry level has been low, and that's produced this situation where those prices in particular are the ones that are growing the fastest.
Missoula Real Estate Today, presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Excuse me. Our guest, Dr. Patrick Barkey, director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Are there any of those kinds of requirements, Patrick, as we kind of close in more on Missoula and Western Montana, are there any requirements in Missoula that, I don't know if surprise you is the best way to say that, things that you don't typically encounter?
Oh, I don't
good
think
or bad.
I don't think so. I mean, all you have to do is go to California or go even to Seattle, and you'll see things you don't typically encounter. But certainly in Missoula, there's I think the thing about Missoula is not unusual, but it's perplexing, and it's not picking on Missoula in particular. So many communities share this, and that is it's really an overlap of regulations. In other words, what you'd like to say is, this one regulation, this one setback rule is a killer. If we could fix this, the gates would open, we'd see building, we'd see price moderation. It's not like that. There's many overlapping, and that fact has led some people, and this has happened in states like Oregon, has led some people to say the solution is not to be found at the local level, it's to be found at the state level, where states override the ability of localities to impose regulations. I mean, if your housing price growth is higher than X, then you must do Y, whatever that is, regardless of what local regulations say. We're not there yet, but I think, given the dynamics of Montana, that could easily happen.
So we don't have that kind of veto power existing in the state of Montana, but your sense is that, well, maybe that's on the horizon?
Well, the veto power exists. I mean, the state has enormous power over city governments in terms of allowing them what they're allowed to regulate and so forth. It's just whether it's exercised or not. I mean, there's a strong ethos that local government works best, right? Nobody likes government from afar, but in housing policy, you could argue, given the spikes in the decline in affordability, that local power has not been too kind. To folks looking for a place to live.
If you were to present that to the city leaders of Missoula and explain your observations, you're making observations that there is a lot of overlap, and give them some examples, what is the reaction or the comeback or the justification?
Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. The justification typically for housing regulation, particularly development of new housing, has to do with what economists call externality. So if you build, you create a lot of dust, you create a lot of mess. So I should be compensated for that. All right. I mean, you're coming into my neighborhood, you're doing these kinds of things. So that's putting it a little bit too simply, but that's the aspect of it, right? I mean, is that it's a topic we talked about last year, and it's a divisive topic. I mean, it's kind of one of the things that's lost in this, wringing of hands about housing affordability and high prices of homes. Prices are just they're tags, right? If you pay it, it's high. If and you don't like it, if you're selling and it's high, you love it. So there's clearly it's a zero sum thing with respect to prices going up and down, with new residents, many of whom aren't here and don't vote, being the ones that are being most affected in the negative way.
Well, that leads into the next question, Lightly. It's no secret housing prices are high in Missoula and other parts of Montana too. Is that a sign of a robust economy? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Oh, I believe it definitely is. In fact, if you look around the state of Montana, not just in Missoula, but especially in Western Montana and definitely in Missoula, one of the healthiest sectors of the economy is finance and banking. It's a healthy sector. Real estate is certainly healthy. Construction is healthy. These are all signs of very healthy real estate markets. And if you don't want to know what I mean by healthy real estate markets, just look at what they were in the Great Recession. There was a full calendar year where no homes sold on Flathead Lake. The entire coastline of the lake, not one piece of property sold. That was at the teeth of the Great Recession. That is not a healthy market. A healthy market is one where people put their houses up for sale, People come to look at them, make offers, they buy, etc. Which is, I guess, what you would say is normal. In a normal real estate market, particularly here in western Montana, which is a very desirable place to live, has plenty of people moving here. It's healthy. Why is it healthy? Well, it's healthy for a couple reasons. One is that we have good growth here. We've got some drivers of growth here in Missoula have been performing quite well. The biggest success story most recently has been tech. Tech is something that's not as well known, even to Missoulians, even though it's happening right here. But there are companies with 200-300 people, that are growing. They have an important presence. They pay high wages, etc. Clearly, the university has not been on that list. University has been going sideways, and that's been a drag on the Missoula economy. Another important part of the Missoula economy is doing well has been, you've seen the federal government, actually, which doesn't get a lot of ink as being an economic driver. It's hugely important in Montana. Federal government is passing budgets. Yes, those budgets have huge deficits, and people don't like that. I'm one of those people. I don't like it. But I'll tell you, the federal government passing budgets is a good thing for Missoula, Montana, at least in the short run, because there's a lot of federal agencies that have budgets, and they're building, they're hiring, and they're part of the economy too.
You just brought this up. I had this question a couple down the line here about the biggest drivers of the Missoula economy. Maybe there's some others that you didn't get a chance to get to. The backbone of the higher paying jobs that help keep the housing market lively. You listed a few examples. Any others come to mind?
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, healthcare is still an important driver, and what I mean by healthcare in this instance is not the healthcare providing healthcare to people who live in Missoula. That's in a sense circulating money that's already here, but western Montana and Missoula in particular is a healthcare hub. There are some ancillary hubs. Kalispell's certainly grown in importance, and Hamilton is growing a little bit. But Missoula is still where a lot of specialty care takes place, so people come to Missoula for health care. Clearly, we have the tourism industry, non-resident visitors who come here either to enjoy Missoula or, in many cases, to go places from the Missoula airport, but this is kind of their headquarters. That's been a very healthy part of the Montana economy, tens of millions of people coming to Montana, spending money here. That's nothing to sneeze at. We've got some other sectors that are smaller. We've got some manufacturing, got some wood products still here. Less so than we were here a decade ago, but
Sure.
Still very important. And finally, we have that, what I would simply call the trade center effect. So we're the place to go to get things. Now, some of those things are like going to a big box store, yes, but there are also things like we're the place to go to see an accountant. We're the place to go, for lots of specialized services of all kinds. They're here in Missoula, and with western Montana doing well, Missoula's doing well.
Missoula Real Estate Today is presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Also, a special thank you to some of Diane's marketing partners that help bring the show. They are Carol Blodgett from MakeItMissoula.com, Miles Link with Opportunity Bank of Montana, and Rob Fleming from Man Mortgage. And our guest today on Missoula Real Estate Today, Dr. Patrick Barkey, Director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research, well-known voice on KGVO. Okay, recession, Patrick. It's always said that it's not a question of if, but when. Are there any indicators that you're noticing that might suggest one is on the horizon, and if so, how severe?
Well, let me check my watch and see how far down the market is today.
Yeah.
The thing we always said about recessions is that you don't see them coming. They're by nature unpredictable. Certainly you can plan for them in the sense that you should be ready for a downturn because exactly as you said, it is a matter of when, not if. As recently as 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were seeing the threat of recession in 2020 to be diminished. A lot of things that were happening that we thought could bring down the economy seem to be stabilizing. And now we have this coronavirus thing here. And this is getting to be pretty scary. What's scary is people are getting scared. So that scares me when other people get scared. When you have an event that even temporarily but substantively impacts ordinary commerce, impacts transportation, impacts specific sectors of the economy like the airline industry, cruise ship industry, tourism industry perhaps, that injects a kind of an unknown. We haven't had a pandemic in this country since 1919. That was not a good event. That was not a good year for the economy for a lot of reasons. So it's, but not to, I don't have any special knowledge of where that's going to go or how it's going to manifest. But I think that is kind of typical of the kind of events that do bring economic growth down are things that no one sees coming. It's kind of hard to believe now as we stand here, no one saw the housing bust coming. Of course, there are a few people that saw it coming. They loudly pronounced that after it was already over. But the fact is a lot of us thought that, housing prices didn't go down, even though that was obviously proved wrong. So it's that kind of surprise is happening. So I'm going to have to really punt on my projection now.
Fair enough.
Because this thing is moving way too quick to know exactly which direction it's going to go.
Yeah. Well, and since we brought up the housing market and we are on a real estate program here, in what ways do you find the real estate industry in the state of Montana, or specifically in the Missoula area, and in what ways do you find the real estate industry relying on your research?
Well, there's real estate is a business where what happens in Washington, D.C. actually matters. And there's two ways in which I mean that. The first is simply the way the economy is managed. If the Federal Reserve decides it's time to raise rates, guess what? Every house that you have in your portfolio you're trying to sell just got a little more expensive, all right? So it's important to understand that the low rates we have today, are those normal? A lot of people don't think so, and yet they've persisted now for quite a few years. Mm-hmm. So it's important to have a strategy and to be aware of some of the undercurrents that could move things like that around. The other way in which what happens in Washington, D.C. matters has to do with housing policy. So realtors depend on a lot of plumbing to work. I mean, think about it. You're bringing people into homes, ask them to put out price tags, which are several factors higher than the cash income they get every year, let alone their take-home income, let alone what they need for other things. So you're depending on a mortgage market that works. You're depending on a mortgage market that has the ability of lenders to be able to securitize, sell loans. You don't worry about that. But if that doesn't work right, your business is immediately affected. And right now we have a system in the U.S. which is kind of a Rube Goldberg kind of a thing. I mean, we've got, and thank God we got realtors to help us manage it, because it's really a headache to try to figure it all out. But we have some pieces of it that are still in play with respect to mortgage guarantees and so forth. Right now, we have the two largest mortgage guarantee entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, is what they're known as. No one even remembers their initials anymore. Right. That's just what they're known as. They're in what's called a conservatorship. And what the heck does that mean? Well, they lost so much money in the Great Recession that the federal government said, guess what? We now own you. And that means we'll assume your debts and so forth. And so right now the federal government owns 80% of those two entities. And that sounds like an emergency measure, and of course it was, and it was an emergency. That was 11 years ago. We're not in an emergency anymore. They're still in a conservatorship. What can we expect? Probably more of the same. But nonetheless, the kinds of things that are happening in housing policy that we know a little bit about can help, warn individual brokers and so forth. Maybe the sand under their feet might shift, or it might not. Depending on how things go. And finally, just the economic developments that either bring new bodies into town or cause people to have to leave town. Economic events of that nature are going to be a big part of the business. They always have been.
Man, what a great guest. Dr. Patrick Barkey, Director of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research, on Missoula Real Estate Today, presented by Diane Beck of Windermere Real Estate. Believe it or not, we're out of time. I really appreciate you coming in.
Oh, it's fun. It's always fun. I love talking about real estate. I should have been a real estate broker. I'd probably drive a nicer car now.
Thank you for listening to Missoula Real Estate Today. Contact Diane Beck with Windermere Real Estate. Email dianebeck@realtor.com or visit her website, homesinmissoula.com. We'll see you next time on Missoula Real Estate Today.